Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and the War Within expansion has introduced with it a brand new form of endgame progression and content of the Delves, featuring their own version of the hard mode challenge of the Zekvir Delve for the Season 1. And similar to the challenge mode dungeons of Pandaria or the Mage Tower of the expansion of Legion, the Zekvir Delve is meant to be the challenge mode for the War Within expansion. And if you want to unlock its unique reward of the Void version of the Delver's dirigible mount, then you have to complete this challenge all by yourself as a solo player, which isn't impossible, but also quite difficult. The most recent adjustments to the Zekvir encounter made it a little bit easier, as it now adjusts some of its mechanics and gameplay based on the class and the spec that you play. So for this guide, I'm going to go over how to solo the hardest version of the Zekvir Delve encounter as a solo rogue player, going over the talents as well as how to deal with all of the different boss mechanics, all of the different strategies, and I'll have a written version of this guide attached to our Discord, which you can find in the description down below. But as always, if you guys want to see more guides like these for the War Within expansion, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. Otherwise, let's dive right into how you too can solo Zekvir for that sweet Void Mount reward. So first things first, what is new with the Zekvir that makes the fight a little bit easier to run into? Well, they did a number of changes for Zekvir. It doesn't make the fight easy or by any measure. It is very doable. It is still challenging, but now a lot more doable and doesn't feel nearly as, almost nearly impossible as it was. The first thing they did is change his damage and health and reduced it on both difficulties, the tier 1 and the tier 2 difficulty. If you're not sure how to unlock either of the difficulties of Zekvir, you unlock the question mark difficulty or the tier 1 challenge difficulty by completing a tier 8 delve with lives remaining. And if you want to unlock the question mark difficulty, the tier 2 difficulty, or rather the hard mode version of this encounter, you then need to complete a tier 10 delve with lives remaining, which is quite a number more difficult. Now the boss's health previously on tier 2, or the most hardest of challenges of difficulty, the boss had a roughly north of 190 million health. And right now, after the nerfs, he has slightly over 180 million health, so it's like a 10 million reduction. It is nice, but still the fight has quite a bit of health, making it all more doable, but still quite difficult. The boss also hits a little bit less hard. By that I mean he still hits like a truck and is going to take huge portions out of your health bar with every single hit. But he no longer hits you for 2/3 of your entire health bar per auto attack, so he becomes a little bit more manageable and in some cases more healable. Zekvir abilities have also taken a bit of a tumble, with Horrendous Roar now having a 2.5 cast time for both phases of the fight, phase 1 and phase 2, making it a little bit easier to dodge. His web terror, as he summons, the hatching time for those adds has been increased, making them a little bit easier to deal with. And the web blast ability for those adds cast time has also been increased, but you still want to make sure to prioritize the adds because you don't want him hatching in the first place. His casted abilities like Spittle and Regenerating Carapace recast times have now been changed while doing this fight as solo to better match each spec's interrupt cooldowns, which makes it easier for specs like Shadow Priest, for example, which has a much longer cooldown for their interrupts to deal with this fight. And it makes it so that you no longer require Brand to be in DPS only mode to help you interrupt, or sometimes interrupt because Brand was never really all that consistent. So this gives you a little bit more room to navigate how you want to load out your Brand for this encounter. Now, the guide we'll be following is not necessarily my guide. All credit goes to a big surprise over in the EU realms, and if you want to give anybody credit, go give them a thank you over on the forum post, because they deserve the credit for figuring out this fight and how to make it a little bit easier when playing your rogue and how to have an easier time soloing this encounter. But for this video, I did follow his guide in order to make my time with this boss even easier, and we're gonna go over how to deal with all of the different mechanics in a very specific of ways. When doing this fight solo as a rogue, there are a couple of different ways that you can approach it, as we have specs like Subtlety, which is great at burst damage on a very short timer, Assassination, which tears through those bosses, but also Outlaw, which does fantastic cleave on different adds. I think with some gear it might be possible to have an easier time as Subtlety or Assassination for this fight, but we're going to be playing this as Outlaw because Outlaw specifically has a much easier time dealing with one of the boss's mechanics, basically making the mechanic a non-issue for the majority of this encounter, which is why Outlaw is the recommended spec. Now, when making a loadout for our Outlaw rogue, we'll be playing the ambush killing spree version of the build. In the class challenge tree, some of the more important parts are going to be things like Iron Stomach to increase the value of healing potions in order to give you better overall healing. We also will be picking up Numbing Poison to slow down the boss's auto attacks, but also slowing down his cast time so it's easier to interrupt some of the boss's mechanics. And for the most part, we will play in the average Double Vanish, Deeper Stratagem, and Thistletea as our main capstones. In the spec talent tree, we're picking up a handful of talents, like we're playing primarily into Hidden Opportunity Ambush build, so we'll have fantastic damage in and out of our cooldowns, while playing around Crack Shot, which gives Vanish kind of a burst window for us to be able to burst down the ad. As for the specific spec talents, we'll be picking up things like Float Like a Butterfly, so we can use the ability of evasion a lot more aggressively, since we'll primarily be the one getting hit by the boss and we'll be holding most of the aggro and tanking the boss directly. You also want to pick up the talent of Killing Spree. We're primarily picking up Killing Spree not for the damage that it offers, but rather to use it in order to deal with one specific mechanic of this encounter. Now, the way that I did the fight is I actually ran a keep it rolling version of this build, which is not a better build, it's just an alternative way to play Rogue. It still has the same defensive components as well as same offensive power, but it plays around the keep it rolling build instead of the ambush build. And this is primarily a preferential thing. This build isn't better than the ambush build. In fact, the ambush build is much easier to geared for, but if you have a lot of haste in your Rogue and you prefer the keep it rolling playstyle, this is just an alternative way to play it, but not necessarily a better build in any regard. And now that we got our talents, we also want to make sure we set up our Bran. For this encounter, we'll actually be setting Bran as a healer, and we'll be using his healing supplies and his healing potions in order to keep ourselves alive. Bran isn't going to be there to really help us, and we're also not really going to be tricksing to Bran in order to have him take a lot of the aggro. We actually don't really want Bran to take too much damage to the face, but there are some moments where Bran is going to be taking aggro naturally, and as a healer, he should be able to survive a good portion of this encounter. As for your Curio, you can do a couple of different ones. I've seen a lot of players run with the Idol of Final Will for the damage that it offers, but I don't really think it's that good. I think the easier one to run is Porcelain Arrowhead Idol, which sometimes procs on either the ads or the boss, making them more likely to be critically stricken by our abilities, which is just a nice passive buff. Plus, the Idol of Final Will requires Bran to have a bit of a cast time, but if he gets feared while casting the Idol of Final Will, sometimes you won't really get any value out of this one at all. For utility Curio, Amorphous Relic seems to be the best choice that most players play into. Whenever you enter combat, you either get the buff of Massive or Miniature. With Massive, which is the better buff that we want, increases your size by 20%, maximum health by 20%, and damage and healing done by 12%, which makes us so much more survivable. Or you get Miniature, which reduces your size, increases your movement speed, which is kind of okay, and increases your haste, which is also kind of okay. We'd prefer the Massive over Miniature, but we're not really going to reset the fight in order to get the right buff every single time. Now, for the actual strategy of Zekvir, we have the phase 1 of the fight and phase 2. The boss is going to start in phase 1 up until he hits his health reaches 60%, and then he'll transition to phase 2. So we'll discuss this fight in phases. In phase 1, we're going to open up on the boss with full cooldowns, and we're going to press evasion immediately to put it on CD. And we're going to be taking the boss for a good bit at the very start. For the most part, at the phase 1, we want to focus on the boss unless an ad is present. And we'll be rotating between evasion and healing ourselves with Bran's potions on the ground in order to keep ourselves alive. Whenever evasion is down and using potions to heal yourself, don't take multiple potions at once. It is better instead to space them out and stagger the healing, because when you pick up a potion, it does instant healing, and that gives you a healing over time effect that can stack. So you want to maximize the healing over time component of the potions, but if you're incredibly low, you may also burn your own health potion if you have any new bags from the auction house, or if you want to pick up 2 potions at once if you're real low on health and just hold the third one for a little bit later. That'll be the better way to maximize the self-healing in this encounter. You can also send your cooldowns into the boss at the very start of the encounter or hold them for the ads. Either way works. If you just want to save all of your cooldowns for the ads, that's a safe way of playing it. But if you are more comfortable playing Outlaw and around the cooldown reduction aspect of the spec, basically the earlier we send our cooldowns, the faster we'll get them back. If you're comfortable with that, then you'll be able to sink in quite a bit additional boss damage while still having some fantastic output for the ad every time it is up. First priority of this fight is to intro the boss at all times. Regenerating Carapace will be the casted ability that we want to interrupt, and it's the only ability you want to interrupt. This ability needs to be kicked every single time. If you have a hard time getting to the boss or reaching him, or let's say you're attacking the ad but want to be able to switch over to the boss very quickly to interrupt, you could use a focus macro for Shadowstep and interrupt, which I'll have in the description down below. But I'll also have all of these macros as well as the talents we discussed earlier in the written section of this guide in our channel Discord if you want to pick it up there directly. But the first thing you want to do is when you target the boss, because the encounter lets you position yourself wherever you want to before you begin it, right click the boss, set focus, and now you have a focus of the boss. And no matter who you target from this point in the fight, you will always have focus of the boss at all times. Using the macro, it'll actually allow you to focus Shadowstep to the boss and focus Interrupt the boss. So using those two abilities for Shadowstep and Interrupt, we can always reposition behind the boss and interrupt him immediately as soon as we need to kick his cast. Thirdly, when the ad spawns, you want to make sure to focus the ad as much as possible. If you want to save your Adrenaline Rush plus maybe an unused damage trinket or vanish, and then spam as many between the eyes as possible with the talent of Crack Shot, that'll be the fastest way for you to take down the ad. If you're dragging the boss with you and you have things like evasion, you can turn on the ability of Blade Flurry so you can cleave the ad and the boss, but you want to make sure you're focusing all your damage on the ad at all times. While you're focusing on the ad, you also want to keep in mind of where the boss is, dodge the abilities, and land interrupts, but the ad has to die before it is hatched. The next mechanic we should talk about is the Amphibilant Spittle, which is another cast ability that we won't have an interrupt for, but we don't necessarily need it. When the boss casts Spittle, it'll put a debuff on you that slows the player while dealing damage. However, any effect that removes a slow also removes this debuff, and this is where the trusty Killing Spree comes in. We don't need to use Killing Spree at maximum common points. If you want to use it just at one common point, it's perfectly fine, as it's an ability that's going to remove all of your slows, have you attack an enemy from all kinds of directions, to add a teleporting the rogue all over the place, which can be a little disorienting, but it removes slows, and that's literally the only reason why we're running Killing Spree. Technically, you can also get rid of the slow with Vanish and Cloak of Shadows, but because Outlay is the only spec that can use 4 abilities, 2 Vanishes, 1 Cloak, and Killing Spree, to always have a way to get rid of the slow, it makes it a little bit of an easier spec to deal with a Zekvir encounter. Now lastly, for phase 1, you want to make sure to dodge the rest of the boss's abilities, whether it is the Claw Smash frontal ability, the Angler's Web linear frontal attack, or the horrendous Roar fear ability, which you just want to back up to make sure that your character doesn't get feared. And you want to keep focusing the boss or focusing the ad while dealing with Spittle, while avoiding the rest of his attacks and making sure that the ads do not hatch up until the boss hits 60% health. This is when the boss transitions into phase 2. With phase 2, the boss will cast the ability of Black Blood, where he'll empower some of his abilities, but during the transition period, the boss takes 0 damage. So if you still have an ad that you gotta finish off, just focus on that quickly as best as you can. In the phase 2, the boss is going to gain 1 new ability, and he will have actually a slightly different modification of original abilities. The new ability you're going to have to deal with is the Unending Spines, and he'll start to cast this ability quite often. For this ability, there isn't any way to deal with it. Just dodge it as much as you can. That's all you can do. Keep yourself moving, try to hit the boss as much as possible, but don't get hit by the spines if you can help it. They hurt a lot. The ability for interrupts will be still just as important, while in phase 2, the boss's heal is actually even more potent than in phase 1, so you want to make sure you interrupt the heal every single time you can. During phase 2, his horrendous roar also becomes transformed. It does a lot more damage, and it also shoots out 4 orbs around the boss. When the boss is casting horrendous roar, you'll actually see a little glow where these orbs will spawn. So just make sure you're not in front of that glow so you can dodge the orbs, because they will one-shot you no matter how much health you have, unless you have things like Cloak of Shadows to be able to mitigate that damage. The Angler's Web ability also becomes a little bit more interesting, as now the boss gains portals with the Angler's Web. So it's no longer a frontal linear attack, but now an attack that teleports from portal to portal, making it much harder to dodge. With this mechanic, just take a big step back and get away from any of the portals. You don't want to be standing in between of the portals, because that makes it much easier for you to get hit by Angler's Web, which is going to make it a little bit harder for you to get around. As for the rest of the encounter, you're still rotating between evasion and potions in order to tank this boss as much as possible. The ad is still always your highest priority, but now you have to deal with all the other mechanics while having to take down the ad. You still want to continue to dodge his abilities like Claw Smash, for example, and you still want to use the Killing Spree and save Killing Spree for whenever the boss casts Spittle. But besides this, it's just a more amped up version of phase 1, and if you can get the phase 1 version of the fight done pretty easily, and if you can adjust to some of the changes happening in phase 2, then the boss is basically yours for the taking. Now, some of the final notes on this encounter, like gear and what stats you should run, and should you buy any consumables for this fight. For gear, I would say the bare minimum item level for this encounter is about 610, and that is at the lowest. Anything lower is only going to make the fight more challenging, but anything higher is only going to make it helpful. So the more gear you have, the easier this encounter can be. Especially if you can nail down the evasion and picking up potions in order to survive this boss, because that is where a lot of the longevity and survivability will come from, as long as you're able to dodge a huge portion of all the enemy mechanics. Having a big unused burst trinket can also be helpful in this encounter, especially if you're struggling taking out those adds. So if you have any unused trinkets that guarantee you immediate damage, like trinkets from dungeons or trinket from raid potentially, all of those can actually make the encounter a little bit easier, because Outlaw's burst damage isn't amazing, so being able to take down the ad immediately or as quickly as possible allows you to get back to the boss and focus in on all the other mechanics for you to dodge and avoid. Lastly, you should also pick up a few consumables if you feel like you are almost getting the fight but are just missing a little bit of damage. Flask of Tempered Versatility can give you quite a bit of defense but also quite a bit of offense. You can also pick up weapon oils or potentially weight stones for blunt weapons or whetstones to sharpen up your bladed weapons in order to give you just a little bit extra attack power. Healing potions like the Elgari healing potions are not expensive in the auction house, and they'll give you quite a bit of healing instantaneously in case you do get hit by a mechanic but it doesn't kill you, so it can help you level out and continue the encounter. You can also pick up drums potentially in order to have something that you can use to give you a big momentary haste during split phases. This one you can either save for phase 2 if you, let's say, have a good burn on the boss, or maybe you just need a little bit more damage for one of the ad phases. You can save drums for that specific part of the fight in particular. But consumables are only going to make the encounter a little bit easier, but they don't actually solve the encounter for you. A huge portion of this fight is still mechanic focused. A huge portion of this fight is still dodging the abilities when they come out, and consumables aren't really going to be able to replace your ability to be able to deal with boss mechanics effectively. They only help you deal a little bit more damage, but not that much more. But if you're able to topple the boss as a solo player, you get access to the Void version of the Delver's dirigible mount, which looks amazing, but it's actually very loud between all the different humming and buzzing of the engines, but also the voidy sound. It's noticeably loud as a mount, but it looks amazing. And the encounter itself was a fantastic challenge that was worth experiencing, and I had a lot of fun with it. I'm hoping they add more encounters like this in future seasons, maybe like a completely different boss fight with new mechanics, but something along these same lines of a challenging solo thing that you could do where you can claim an awesome reward is something I definitely want to see going forward out of this expansion. But with that being said, I do want to thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I hope all of you enjoyed. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community where you can get direct access to the written version of this guide if you want to try out for the mount as well as the challenge yourselves. Also, let me know what your thoughts in the comments down below. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.